with that, Jenny, we are at 8:01. So why don't we get started?
All right, I'll take a second here to find our deck for this morning. There we go. And as always, we know we have people joining us, from across Canada and possibly beyond Canada as well. Feel free to pop into the chat. Let us know where you're joining us from today. But for those of us in Canada, we all acknowledge we have a very important part to play. Honestly, it's a small part, but the importance is significant, and that is in advancing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's call to actions. One of the ways that we can do that is to acknowledge and recognize where we are today. Craig and I are based in Calgary, as is SAIT's campus. And this is almost the view. We're a little further east than SAIT's view, but it's a good winter view, which is what Calgary has been thrown into again this week.
Yep.
So for us, yeah, and the cold too, actually. We're situated on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, and that is the Indigenous people of the Treaty 7 region, which includes the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina, and the Stoney Nakoda, as well as the Northwest Métis homeland. SAIT also acknowledges all of the people who make their homes in the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta. Wherever you are today, thank you for just taking this moment with us to recognize the land that you're connected to.
Excellent. Thank you, Jenny. And yes, Jocelyn agreed. Jenny does a fantastic job of the land recognition. So, and Pincher Creek Airdrie South, we've got a real Southern Alberta vibe going here this morning. So that's fantastic. We want to talk about feed forward. And I think a couple of weeks ago, we hosted an event where pivot, the word pivot was used about 15 times in the first 5 minutes. And I tried to outlaw it, but it didn't work. So we will very much move on to the word feed forward in a couple seconds here. But I think where we want to start is kind of looking backwards a little bit. And Jenny, you know, this whole concept of providing feedback, accepting feedback, ultimately, what's the purpose? Why do we do, as leaders, why do we focus on feedback, and what are we trying to accomplish by providing it? And then we can start talking about, you know, why it's not perhaps the best and how we can change that.
Okay. Why? You know what? I think there's a piece because we've been told to, because everybody else does. Somewhere there probably was some evidence that if we were effective with it, the behavior would change. And we catch on to those things and we hold on to them. The problem with feedback in a lot of cases, and I'm going to speak really generally here, so this isn't going to apply to everybody who's listening to us, but in a lot of cases, when we deliver feedback, the message kind of comes from the leader: you need to do it my way. You need to be like me. At its very, very worst, I'll tell you what, I'm going to teach you a lesson. Or I'm right, you're wrong, or you're not as effective as I am. And often, let's be fair, probably the intent is good. I want you to succeed. I'd like you to do better. Our team needs to grow, whatever that might be. The intent is good. But the impact comes as, here it is, here's me, and I need you to be like me. And the other thing that I think that's happened with feedback, and I don't know where this happened, but we've done it throughout, is we focus on what we're not good at. So we focus on the weaknesses, we focus on the failures. And that to me is a point where feedback becomes almost useless, because if I spend my life as a leader looking for weakness and looking for failures, all I'm doing is correcting people. And we get into that shift. You and I've talked about this a lot. And I don't feel like an adult at work if I'm constantly being corrected and told I'm not good enough.
Yeah.
So I think there's good in it, but I'm not sure that we do it the right way.
Yeah, I think there's also a bit of an assumption in there when you're the one providing feedback, that you're right. There is. I saw a Buckingham video the other day, and he made the comment more on the fact it's not that you can actually provide feedback on what you've done. You're providing feedback on your reaction to what you've seen somebody do, right?
Yeah.
Which
Yeah.
may be semantics, but the piece of it is, is this all about telling somebody what we think of their performance? Is this about corrective action, or is it about, I guess in its best case, it should be about coaching and lifting somebody up? But how do we, I think that's where it sometimes falls down, is folks get hung up on it being criticism versus productive, right? This whole concept of constructive criticism, it's a bizarre one, but how do you start to make that adjustment from, I suppose some of it comes in the delivery, right? How I'm providing that news to you or that feedback. But is this, is this all about just telling folks what we think of their performance? Because that falls into performance appraisals, which is a whole other conversation that we've had before. So.
Okay. That was a lot in there.
I know. Yeah, I've had a couple of cups of coffee, Jenny. So feel free to pick which pieces of that you like.
You're ahead of me. Okay, there's a couple that really stand out there, and they're important. You mentioned right at the beginning of there, because I'm right. And two things with that. Yes, okay, you are right. From your perspective, your truth, your experience, at that point, you're right. The piece that we often miss is that we haven't found out what's going on the other side. And so there's a really posh term around this, but when we make a mistake, we blame it on context, environment, these kind of things. When somebody else makes a mistake, we're much more likely to blame it on them as a person. So we get that fallacy slightly incorrect. So you are right from your perspective, but you don't know the other perspective yet.
Right.
Then the other part of that was really interesting is, how much do we dive in and control that conversation? So there's a part of conversation is known as voice share. If I report to you, okay, we're in a conversation, ideally that voice share is 50-50, 50% your voice, 50% my voice. In a sort of extremely phenomenal world, you're actually going to talk less than me. But in most cases, the leader comes in, the leader's been there, seen it, done it. They have a solution already because they're good at it. And they dive in, they do the talking, they fix the solution, and they get them on the way.
Yeah.
And actually, when you backpedal from that, who is struggling with the issue, the mistake, the behavior, whatever it might be? Me. Whose job is it? Mine. Whose career is it? Mine. Why are you talking? So, just let me do the talking and let me tell you. And then the other thing, and I cannot let you get away with putting those two words in one sentence, constructive criticism cannot be in the same sentence. When eventually when that book of Jenny comes, chapter 1, constructive criticism, no. And so when we criticize somebody, what happens in their brain is they go into fight and flight. And so they're literally protecting themselves.
Yeah.
You're never, ever going to have a good conversation from there.
Yeah.
But you can be constructive.
Sure.
And there's more, but I'm going to let you talk.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I was poking the beast a little bit.
I know
when
you
said
were.
that it was going to trigger. And Tom had a perfect comment here in the chat, is that, criticism and feedback are not the same thing. Absolutely. Right.
True.
Criticism is intended to be hurtful. Feedback, I think in its noblest form, is meant to be helpful and instructive.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I was just to say, so there, if people who are here, people come looking to take things away, number one, are you being helpful or are you hindering the person? Are you being cruel or are you being kind? Like, simple. There's a really good checklist for you as a leader before you go in.
Yeah. There's a question here early on I'd like to get to from Dave. Does this vary depending on the situation? Is it a formal review, on the spot performance, critic, or because complaints have arisen? So obviously there's some layers to this one. Is, again, what is the purpose of the feedback in the moment, right?
And I think here's the point where actually we want to leave feedback. You said it when we were together 2 weeks ago. It's history, and we want to dive into that feed forward. So 2 ways that you can approach it. Feedback generally is self-expression. This is about how I see it, how I'd like it, how I think the best way is. Feed forward is about strategy. How can we make it better? How can we improve? And the it is interesting, because it's not my job to change you. You have a day job to do, and the feed forward is on that day job. We have to focus on the behavior and move away from the person. And so to the question, does it vary? I'm a big believer that a conversation is a conversation. The problem with the performance reviews, and it's not our job to go there, but they're very much checklist based. And those who've come regularly know I have a soapbox in that department. But if you're having a continuous conversation, if you catch an error, or actually even better, if you catch somebody doing something right, those are the points where we want to have that conversation. Because when I do it right, I know what that feels like. I can repeat that. But if you're asking me to do something that you do that's successful for you, I have no mental model of that to build on at all. It's hard for me, and it's tiring.
Yeah, well, it goes back to what you said earlier, I think, is this whole concept of perception, right?
Yes.
My perception of the moment is entirely different from yours. And until we have that conversation, we don't know what that is.
No.
Right. And so how do you lean into that? I was trying to set you up for your prop there, Jenny. There you go. Right.
There you go.
So go ahead.
Yeah. So I think this is important. Those of you who've hung out with me in a classroom know these appear regularly. And it's not mine. It comes from, the analogy comes from Susan Strong. I'm pretty sure it's Susan Strong on Fierce Conversations. But every conversation, whether it's feed forward, feedback, recognition, performance reviews, chatting with your teenager or even your toddler tonight, every conversation starts a bit like a beach ball. And as we arrive at that conversation, Craig, as you come in, your perspective is yellow. However hard you try, you're going to see it as, I should have picked orange for your wall. Your perspective is yellow. And that's how you see it. And if you work really hard, you can see blue and you can see red, but you're here. And as I come to that conversation, my perspective's green. And if I try hard, I've got white and I've got orange going on there. But at the start of that conversation, we're here.
Yeah.
And when we're here, the cool piece of this is in every conversation, there's two truths, two realities, two perceptions, and they're both right. And as you just said, which is brilliant, in order to get to here, I have to find out what's going on there for you.
Yeah.
So in that, in that case of when we want to offer feedback, maybe the first question could be, how did that happen for you? Or what was occurring at the time? Or what did you think of that performance? Or how did you think that call went? Whatever it might be that we're looking at, if we have to give that kind of feed forward.
Absolutely. And I think you could take that analogy a little bit further and say at the start, there's a bunch of hot air in between, Jenny, that you need to kind of deflate and get out of the way.
I can own that, but
right. But what you're touching on is something that Tom also put back in the chat earlier, right? So how do you start that conversation? And I think it's a great point is, this is my interpretation of what's going on. Am I missing something?
Yes, I love that. I really do. Tom, I think you said that's phenomenal. And the other one that I hear quite often, I've used it myself too, is, here's the story I'm telling myself. Can you give me the real version? Ooh, because I am going to make a story up on how I would do it, how I would see it.
Yeah. Again, folks, if you've got questions, please toss them into the Q&A. I'm going back. There's one in the chat here that I wanted to come to. From Sarah. I'd love to hear your thoughts on when the coaching approach, asking questions to lead someone to their own solution, isn't having the intended effect. How do you approach a conversation from here?
I think we're going to dive into this in a few weeks' time, if I remember our conversations. But this coach approach is really, really popular at the moment, and I like it. There's a lot of good in it. But I think perhaps, Sarah, I think this was the thing, is what's the conversation that you need to have? And so sometimes we actually need to teach, especially if we're trying to lift them to a new level, or we're working on a skill set that they perhaps don't have. And so you can ask every question you want, but what I don't know, I don't know. And so maybe the first question is to find out where are they at? What is their skill level at? And then build the conversation from there.
A couple more questions have popped up here. I love this early on. How do you approach feedback with highly technical coaching? In some circumstances, we are regulated to industry standard, and sometimes it can be as simple as right or wrong. For example, the person did or did not follow the predefined standards or policies.
So I think that's something that we should be quite sort of clear on, is there are some industries where actually feedback is essential. Here's what you did. It wasn't per checklist. It wasn't per process. And I still think it's worth, what was going through your head, or what happened that caused you to miss this, if that's relevant. But, there's a reason that airlines and medical have checklists and those procedures, is they're essential. And so, I think we have to be clear on that there's a place for that, absolutely. And that, in that part, perhaps that's a conversation as a leader. The expectation is that you can meet and work to this. Are we aligned? Do you have the skill set that I believe I've hired you for? And then if the answer to that is yes, and you're agreed on that, then you're able to come back to that quite easily and say, we've talked about this. We had this alignment. This is missing. What was going on? And then carry the conversation from there.
Yeah, I think in some of those situations, it can be as simple as, it is black and white. Right?
It is, yeah.
Right. There are some times where that is true, although there's shades of gray and so much more. I think this kind of leads into the other question that we have up here, is how do you handle feedback where somebody needs to be reprimanded? And so, that one for me, okay, if it's on one of these checklist type of items, and we've talked about it before and set that expectation, that starts to become a different conversation than feed forward. Yeah. But, perhaps, maybe there's more in this one around if there's something that's happened in a moment that really does require that corrective feed forward.
And I'm going to stand the risk of upsetting a few people here, but as a leader, when you have a conversation with one of your team, that conversation is adult to adult, period. So we run the risk of getting quite parental when we talk about reprimanding and disciplining people. So first off, I'm going to say check in this way. Okay? Sometimes you actually have to mentally forgive that action before you can deal with it, because that action has happened. Now, it doesn't take away the seriousness of it. Doesn't mean that there isn't a difficult conversation. But if you are angry, frustrated, disappointed, embarrassed, whatever it might be, that's an emotional intensity. Take care of that. Then have that conversation. The only thing that stands aside of that is if there's a safety issue, get in there straight away. Like if there's harm that's going to come to somebody, you got to deal with that straight away. And that's a different strategy case there. So once you've done that for yourself, then you're going to deal with that reprimand, but you're still dealing with an adult, and an adult deserves respect and they deserve the conversation. And again, my first question is going to be, that was a different behavior. That's not what I was expecting. Can you tell me what was occurring, or can you tell me what was going on in that moment? Get their side. You still don't know. You think you know. Okay, yeah. Absolutely, you think you know, but you still don't know until you've asked. If somebody's done the same thing 2-3 times after that first conversation, that's a different conversation. We've got a completely different ball game going on at that point.
Absolutely. And can we maybe we can dive into this a little bit more in terms of, how soon does that feed forward need to happen? right? Because I think there's a couple things that go on, especially in those situations where you may be looking to reprimand or provide corrective action. Again, safety is a totally separate ballgame. But there are those moments where heated conversations arise, conflict comes in, conflicts in a couple of weeks, folks. But there has to be and sometimes there has to be a cooling off period, I think, before you can effectively have that conversation.
Yeah.
But is the tenet of feed forward needs to be timely and relevant. Like, where does it override? Is it as simple as, Jenny, we need to have a conversation about this, but we're going to take a pause and come back and catch up on this in an hour, 2 hours tomorrow? Like, how close do they have to be together?
I think it depends on you as an individual. You've got to know yourself. And we've said that so many times in here too, because for some, under that intensity, stress, and pressure, we don't overextend much. It is possible for me to, all right, that is really annoying, but I'm going to deal with it right now. Okay, that sits in my personality, that sits in my way. And in that case, dealing with it as close to the behavior, what you just said there is really relevant. The timing, our brains, the closer it is to the behavior, the more of a sort of cognizant attachment we make to it. So we understand it, we believe it far better. If you talk to me tomorrow, I respect that. For some, it is going to take that long. And by the way, if you're still angry tonight over something that happened this morning, that's because you're reattaching to it. So it really is annoying you because you're reattaching and making yourself angry. Anger only lasts about 18 minutes at absolute most. And so an hour later, I think if you can, is much better because it's still closer to the behavior. You ask me tomorrow what I did today, I'm just going to look at you blankly for a few seconds while I try and remember. Yeah. So the individual piece is, what do you need to get from right down to, okay, I can deal with this, and then have that adult to adult conversation.
I think, I like that. And although I would argue during COVID, it's really simple to say, what you did yesterday, because it was the same as the day before and the day before, but that's a different conversation. Tom, thank you for your comments here this morning, but the piece of, we have to deal with our emotions before logic kicks in, right? Yeah. And it is so true. Question here about, I'm thinking it's basically the statement is, can you go more into feedback and criticism? I think it's probably asking to expand on feed forward, and maybe we could, maybe we could go from the perspective of let's deal with criticism first and kind of just touch on that and what it is and isn't. And then you've got a great slide here that I think we should talk about the feed forward portion.
Okay. So are we leaving criticism? So
let's talk about what it is first. Like, let's just put a pin in what is criticism versus what feed forward will be.
I'm going to suggest that criticism is unnecessary and it's all about you, and you got to let that go.
Right.
Period.
I agree. Right. And I think criticism is intended to be potentially harsh or hurtful.
Yeah.
I think there's more of an intent in criticism, a negative intent versus a positive forward-looking feed forward. So, and here we go.
Yes. And I'll just, everybody who's here gets these slides, but I'll go back one. Oh, no, back, please.
There we go. To go back. It's all forward today, Julie.
Thank you. And that's exactly, I think that's what you just said. Feedback at its real worst is, I'm going to teach you a lesson, but it's with that pointed finger, teach you a lesson. I'm out to have the last word. I've got to prove that I'm right. And it often ends up in that sort of blame, shame, judgment piece. So, and it's actually not helpful because it's all about us. When we look at feed forward, we're looking at an outcome that we want to change. We're looking at, let's have a conversation about this. Can we make it better? Even better if. So we're looking to that strategy. We're looking to how we improve something, how we get better. We're focusing on the task at hand. Lots of people here will be familiar with Pixar's brain trust. And if you haven't heard of Pixar's brain trust, what they do is when there is a seed of a movie in its very beginning form, they have a brain trust that comes in, and literally every single conversation within that brain trust is about making that movie better. So what's missing? What do they see that could be changed? It's not a personal attack on the people who put it there. It's set to really make that movie better. And when you read into it, it's phenomenal to see one of the Toy Stories, I think, where that started and where it finished, all down to those brain trusts that came in. The other thing with Feed Forward is that we hold our counterpart, the other person in the conversation, in really high esteem. You know, I'm offering this because I believe that you can, or I believe you have this skill set, or, you know, if you know your people, I know you have the strengths. And that's another key piece that we haven't talked about yet. When we talk about people's strengths are easy to them. We can just do that. That comes naturally. There's that mental model that we were talking about. If you say to me, you know, Jenny, I know that you can have a conversation. That's what we're doing today. This is a conversation. Let's take the skill set here and put it into there. I know that you can take this on. So now we're improving, or we're lifting that game, that issue, that behavior, whatever it might be, to a different place. And the difference in this is because it's forward looking, because it's lifting the person and lifting the skill set. We like to get better. Now I'm able to thrive. Whereas when you're constantly correcting me, putting me down for what I can't do, showing up my weaknesses, I'm simply surviving. And I'll get the day job done, but I'm not lifting in that space. So feedback, self-expression, feed forward, more strategy-based.
I like that. And sorry, it's just blown past here. Kay has an interesting summary of this. So criticism equals a focus on the person and or personality. Feed forward equals a focus on the outcome or future state.
Absolutely. Yep.
Love it. Love it. I think that's fantastic.
Thank you.
Question here. How do you give feedback on a touchy subject when the recipient of the feedback demands to have the conversation on the spot when emotions are still running high?
Ask for time. First off, I don't need an answer to this, but what's the touchy subject? Is it something that we should need to be offering feedback on or feed forward on? Let's make that shift right away.
Yep.
And if your emotional intensity is high, there's that fabulous, I was trying not to do any acronyms this week, but HALT is a familiar one: hungry, angry, lonely or late, and tired. You know, if your emotional intensity is up there, really the answer is we can have the conversation now. I don't think it's going to be productive. Can we chat in an hour? I can see it's important to you, but I just need some time to approach this in a manner that will be helpful to you. We want to be helpful, not hinder.
Yeah. And I think sometimes we forget that, right? As leaders, it is okay to, you know, express that vulnerability of, hey, I'm not in a good headspace right now to have this conversation with you. I want to. Let's take a pause. I love that, right? And I think we sometimes as leaders feel we aren't allowed to have emotion or aren't allowed to show emotion and have to be able to have the answer or have the ability to have the conversation on the spot, which is just such an unrealistic expectation that we would put on ourselves.
Yeah,
right?
there's really no sense in it. We're emotional human beings. Like, yes, pause.
Yeah. Raphael's got a question in here. How would you start a conversation focusing on feed forward? Ultimately, I do love this one. It's okay. We've been talking about feed forward. How do we start that, Jenny?
So I think some of it is about there's two things in here. One is, can we build a culture of this? So you hear people, they'll use feedback, but you hear them saying, yes, it's a gift. I can only grow if I know what I'm doing wrong. Yeah, and you're right. Yes. Although most of us don't like it because of the way that it's often given. We'll say we like it, but we struggle with it. So in that feed forward piece, the easiest way to start the conversation is make it part of your everyday conversation. And so building that culture of conversation as a leader, what are you doing in your team meetings? You could have a I like, I wish statement and just run around the table. What do you like about what's going on? What do you wish was happening? You can do that with individuals. I really like the idea of peer-to-peer reviews as well as leader to employee reviews. The actual specific conversation, how do you start that conversation? It depends how you're set up. If you have one-on-ones, you can ask the question, is there anywhere where you would like feed forward from me? Okay, what's going on their side of the beach ball? And here's the key. If you're a leader and you ask that question, it is actually your job to give feed forward. So if you've asked it and they say, yes, I'd like it in this area, to say, well, I think you're doing great. There's nothing I can add. Isn't really helpful when somebody says, I want to grow, I want to build in that space. And to be fair, if you've got a really strong performer, you might not have anything at that point. Okay. So from my perspective, I don't see anything that I can add that's going to strengthen that right here, right now, but I've got it. I'm going to watch for that. I'll pay attention. But who else can we ask? Because, quite often, well, let's think about it here. I could ask you for feed forward, but you have absolutely no idea what I get up to when I'm working with your clients. So actually, that would be a way better place for you to say, well, let me just have a good conversation with so-and-so, so I'll bring it back to you. Actually, I'd ask for it myself, but that's a way that you could do it. So I think it's asking the question, if it's peer-to-peer and it's not set up, because it takes some time to build this. But if I came along and I said, hey, Craig, I have some feed forward, would you like it? And you say to me, no, thank you. I got to get out of there. It's not my place to give it to you. And that's tough too, because this would make it better. Lucky.
Yeah. There is, and I'll put this in the follow-up materials, but there is a fantastic article. It was in Harvard Business Review a couple of years back from Marcus Buckingham that gives you some good phrases to chat about, right? So instead of saying, can I give you some feedback? Start with, here's my reaction, right?
Yeah.
Instead of good job, here's 3 things that really worked for me. What was going through your mind when that happened, right? And so there's some interesting plays on how, because we typically go to the quickest way to say something, which brings me to another question I want to ask about how candid should we be in feed forward. But sorry, you look like you were going to tweak on something from that.
First off, that article is phenomenal. It's a long read, so pour yourself a cup of coffee but do. Craig's not missing a beat there at all. And what I like about it, and those examples that you just gave from it, is it really leans on what are the strengths and how do we build those strengths. And if you want to have a good conversation, come in on those strengths. Everybody has them. Without fail, everybody has them. And if you can't see them in somebody in your team, there's some really big conversations to happen there first.
Yeah, I just threw it in the chat. It will come out in the follow-up material as well. So a couple other questions here. And one goes to something I wanted to ask you about. And so I'm going to go there first before I get to how candid should we be in our feed forward. But how do you approach feed forward with someone who thinks they're perfect and don't have any opportunity to grow? The other side of that, I think the question I was chatting with you about earlier is, this kind of goes to me, is how do you approach feed forward with somebody who perhaps just lacks self-awareness? If you can actually make that observation about somebody, maybe they do, maybe they just don't care.
I think you just answered your own question, actually.
Okay, good. Move along.
So the self-awareness one is interesting. First off, again, I'd be checking in. Is this about me or is this about you? Because when we offer in that conversation, even if we're looking at feed forward, we're still coming from sort of our perspective. As hard as we try, it is going to be, based on what we see, what we do, what we know. So their lack of self-awareness is what we've got to offer them actually important, useful. The other one that's really good is it a secret? Because if it's only you that thinks it, and it's only you that gets annoyed by it, or only you that thinks it needs to change, there's probably you. But if it's a shared piece of feedback, okay, now we've got something actually quite concrete. This is being seen from a number of places. I would, again, with the person who perhaps you think they don't have the self-awareness, can you catch them doing something right? And you're building on what everything you just said from that article is good, because that gives you a different platform to come in on.
Yeah.
Focus on the behavior, absolutely, because then we lose it from the person. And we have to remember, everybody has a story. Now, it's not our job to necessarily know that story, but if you have someone who has grown up where that feed, in those cases, it would have been feedback, and they have been blamed, shamed, and judged every single step of the way, they're never going to show you that they're hearing you. The hope is that they hear you. But the last thing I'm going to let you have is that, because the defenses, the armory's gone up really, really strongly there. So it's tricky, but I check in first. What's the conversation that you need to have?
Yeah, because I guess, in the question that was posed here is, there is some assumption in the, the question was someone who thinks they're perfect, right?
Okay, and then
right. So but I was going to say, to unpack what you were going, that road you were going down there, is that is my, as I'm reading the question from the person's perspective here, that's my impression of you thinking that you're perfect. In fact, you may not. I think we all know the type of individual that is being referenced in the question, but again, to your point, I think you need to check in somehow on that, is to find out, how does that individual think that situation went?
Yeah, and that perfectionism, two things. One, can we approach it from, if we're looking at a specific, let's say a presentation or an instance, what went well? What would you suggest that would make it even better? Okay, so that what went well, even better if. Because if I literally do think I'm perfect, I'm always going to be able to find a way. I'll tell you what went well. I am talking now. And then, okay, and what do you think would make it even better if we wanted to raise the bar a little bit for next time, what do you think would add to that? So you're giving them control of the conversation. There's that voice share part. Yeah,
and I like that, because you actually, to your point, you're leaning into that perfection piece. I like the way you turn that. Well, no, because what you're saying to your, if they're saying they're good at it, well, tell me why you're good at it.
Yes.
So I like that. How do you encourage a feed-forward culture when not a leader or in a traditional role of leadership? So this for me is also a bit of a question I was going to ask you around. We've chatted about feed-forward being from leader to employee, but how do you also create that peer-to-peer feed-forward environment?
It's easier if it's embraced by the whole team. if you're starting to make those changes, I think the key is ask for it. Ask for feed forward, and set the context. Okay, this is what I've done, or this is what I have. I would really like to improve it, raise the bar, increase the expectations on it. Can you offer me some feed forward? And everybody likes to feel valued, and I would be comfortable saying this. Craig, I appreciate your opinion. I really am looking for a different perspective on this. Can you offer me some feed forward here? And the more that you do that, you model that, you roll that, then it becomes a part of the culture, because it becomes safe. And we've that whole psychological safety conversation sitting in the background here. But because I feel safe asking for it, and maybe I've asked you 2 or 3 times, you're like, well, maybe Jenny would give that back to me. I'm going to ask Jenny for her perspective. And then you'll ask me the same thing. And it's slow, but you will get momentum there if you're starting at kind of just on the ground level there.
Yeah, and I would like you to actually slide 9, Jenny. I think this is an important one here, is that when you are asked for that feed forward, what should you do? Because I think there's, you've got some great insight here, or some great ideas here as to.
The sandwich keeps wanting to show up. We can come back to the sandwich. Apparently it's meant to be seen. It's a good picture. This is the slide you're talking about?
Yep.
Okay. So here's if you like, it's not a checklist. Like, we have models, we have things we practice. You're going to need to come and hang out with us for longer than an hour to find those out. But these are simple things that today you can do at any time. And that top one is the most important part here. The swivel your chair is a John Amici expression. But what he talks about is, if I'm doing this and talking to you, if we were face to face, you haven't got my full attention. So when you're having these conversations, be 100% present. Swivel your chair completely to have that conversation. We've talked about focusing on the specific behavior. Here's your candid piece, Craig. You mentioned this earlier.
Yeah.
Yes, be straightforward, be honest. It is incredible how we lack clarity in these conversations. We will skirt like this to avoid hurting somebody. Hey, we're nice people. We don't want to hurt people. Yeah. So clear is kind is your favorite person's expression. That's Brené Brown, for those who don't know. So, be honest, but come from kindness. And so, that when you want to say, I'm just telling you the truth, or I'm just being honest, probably check in. We're going to need a filter on that, but we still want the clarity. Brutal honesty not always having a place. Yeah. So generally talk less and focus in on the behavior with clarity. I've said this already today, we're adults in a conversation, right? That's really, really important. There's no place for parenting, being that teacher, being that principal, whatever that role is playing in your head, adults, side-by-side conversation. And then who's in control of the conversation? If you're talking all the time, you're controlling the conversation. And when we're anxious, that's what happens. So if you're somebody that normally backs away from this, you're like, I'm going to have the conversation. And then you're talking and talking and talking and talking. All you're doing is controlling the conversation. And that's the safe place to be, because they probably won't interrupt you. They're not going to question you, and you're on safe ground because you're holding it. It takes courage to say, what happened for you? Or what do you think? And then to stop, literally stop talking at that point. Yeah.
I would add in here too, when you talk about swiveling the chair in this remote world, I think it's got to be stare at the camera. Right? Because that is the piece right now that it is so easy. I'm sure everybody watching is going, what the heck is he looking at all the time? But I got the chat and the slides and things going here. But that's that moment, that truly is that piece of connection in this virtual space that we're at now, is to stare, make sure you're staring at that camera, right? So
and remember too, if you're staring at me, okay, if you're looking at me through the camera, I'm looking at your eyes. So I'm not looking back at you, and that's where it gets tiring. Doesn't mean that you stop. You're absolutely right, Craig. Like, keep that camera focus. Yeah.
There are a few questions that I think we're going to have to get to in the follow-up, because we're at 8:45, and yes, Dave and Dana and Daryl, I agree this could be a much longer conversation. So we may have to come back to this one in the future. But Jenny, I think it's time to start wrapping up and give folks one big idea.
One big idea.
Jenny is doing that. I'll just throw a reminder in the chat to please give our LinkedIn page a follow. And Jenny.
There we go. Oops. Oh, geez. That's not the big idea. Here's our big idea. Okay, so the big idea for today, can we assume positive intent? And this is actually much harder than it sounds. We had a client, Craig, who was at MEC, and they ran an MRI on conversations. What is the most respectful intent? I love that. So before you react, before you let the ego stream in, before you need to be right, whatever it might be, can you assume positive intent? So that, going back to that, oh, I got to reprimand so-and-so, actually just pause, assume positive intent. What was going on there? It's just kind of one of those checklists. It changes the mindset and means we can leave criticism, we can leave reprimands, we can actually just have constructive conversation. So that's the big idea out there. 2 strategies that you can take away today. The first one I've talked about a little bit. What's your voice share in the conversation? If you are here as a leader, can you get that down to 50-50? Even can you switch it sort of out of sync? So you're talking less and giving your report, your employee, whoever that might be, the control of the conversation. And you're going to learn so much if you can switch that voice share. And you can ask them how you do on that one if you wish. Here's a big one. You will get these slides, but I love this exercise. You're right, we could talk for hours on this. We didn't really look as a team how you can build that team culture of feed forward. I think the Netflix model is possibly way down at one extreme. I don't think we need to start there. Like, just start small. So 1 breath feed forward, providing you don't have any synchronized swimmers or divers on your team, this one should work. And it's I've written it here based on a face-to-face model. There's no reason why you couldn't adapt it to virtual. And if you're fresh back in the office next week, don't stand close in a circle. Some people are going to be really uncomfortable with that. But take a deep breath. And what feed forward can you provide to the person on your right before your breath runs out? When your breath runs out, you're done, time up. And then it passes on and the next person does it around. As a leader, listen carefully. You're going to learn so much in that peer-to-peer feed forward around the circle. If this is absolutely new to you and your crew, there's a few ideas down the bottom. Set the sentence structure for them. So I mentioned this one earlier. What do you like and what do you wish? Okay, that's within your breath. Or stop, start, continue is another one that you can play with. Or you can play with the sentences too. So my role would be much easier if the rest of the sentence is that breath. It doesn't take long, make a huge difference in your cohesion on your team. Start with fun stuff and then build it up as people get used to and comfortable with the exercise. And then we offer 3 questions, but last time we were here, I had 6. So I did 6 again because I could. So in general, from our conversation today, go ask somebody for feed forward. Who can give you some decent feed forward? Try it out. We only get good at this when we work on it and when we play with it. We all have blind spots. They're uncomfortable. So how are you going to find out what those are? That's worth noodling on. And what's the stage that you set? We have to set those boundaries and understanding that feed forward is safe and crucial for us. And if you have to give feed forward today, 3 little questions there. I think I've talked about all of them today, so they don't need explaining. There you go.
Fantastic. We are back again in a couple of weeks, and Gina will be joining us. So I'm very excited about that, and looking forward to a conversation around how to resolve conflict. So I think it's going to tie into some of the stuff we talked about earlier. Other than that, have a fantastic day. Have a great weekend. And Jenny, as always, I so appreciate what you bring to this conversation. Thank you.
You're very welcome. It's 2 of us, so I appreciate you too. Thank you.
Have a great weekend, everybody. Take care.
Have a good weekend. Take care, everyone.